The
introduction of the Vario technology was impressively achieved with the Fendt 926 in 1995. Naturally, there were then the requirements to introduce the Vario transmission into lower power ranges as well. And the first was the 700 series in 1998, followed quickly in '99 by the 400 series. Paul, what was the motivation and what were the background factors in developing this 400?
Yes, the market situation was such that the competition, or our market companions, were already far ahead of us in some areas. I'd just like to mention wet brakes, then they already had, in part, a central all-wheel drive, or the whole front axle suspension story and so on. So in some respects, we were not up to date. Also regarding the transmission. With manual transmissions, we simply were no longer meeting the requirements the market demanded.
And then,
yes, then, as already mentioned, with the 700 series, that was a bit of the leading machine. And we followed in its wake with the 4-cylinder machines. Of course, there were various considerations. How do we bring this across cost-effectively? Do we build it in block construction like the old 300 series? Or do we lean on the technology of the 700 series?
what did the first sketches look like?
Well, some said we want the vehicle equipped the same way as a 700, which of course was a huge cost challenge. If we had brought it over into block construction, then the ML transmission would have been a single solution. Only for this vehicle. You couldn't have used it for other machines. We always tried to create a certain modular transmission kit from which each could draw something. And at that time, because all these emissions regulation topics were not yet fully developed, we also always considered the Fendt GT. Yes, I also brought along some pictures. At one point, the idea was that the 400 should have a completely different, design-wise different look than the 700. I brought something from my archive for you. We failed miserably with our design there. It just wasn't a hit.
You can understand it today.
Today it might be totally modern, back then impossible. Yes, and then we simply took a close look at the 700, and essentially also for our subsequent departments, that is, machining centers. If a 700 frame runs on a machining center, then you can also produce a 400 frame on it. You could reuse the tools, or in assembly, it was possible to assemble 400 and 700 frames interchangeably. So it had more or less only advantages. That's why we agreed. We'll try to orient ourselves as closely as possible to the direction of the 700 series, and I think that proved to be right.
Which models were there at the beginning?
We started with very low power, 409, 410, 411. Then, as it became clear these models were well received by customers, we gradually added 412, 413, 414, 415.
But the idea was also to offer the Vario transmission under 100 horsepower, and many were convinced that something like that wouldn't work at all.
Those were more the final expansion stages. Well, I'd put it like this. In the entire development department, no one had any doubts that it would also work for the smaller types. And I really have to say, hats off to our transmission department for what they achieved at that time. It wasn't just the ML transmission. We also needed a rear axle for it, axle housings PTO. I believe the 400 was the first to have a ground speed PTO.
So it was the four-cylinder class from roughly 95 to 150 horsepower, with a total of 25,000 units sold. The top model was indeed the 415, which had the aura of a GTI among tractors, light, lively, and dynamic.
So things were definitely changing. And economical, fuel efficient, which is why we started with the 4 cylinders in the first place. And in my view, it was also like this. Because we had the same operating philosophy from the 900 series down to the small 4, you get in, press the button, push the lever forward, the machine runs. And we had a lot of field feedback saying the old farmer on the farm wouldn't get off the new tractor anymore. Because it was just, speaking casually, a breeze to operate without having to learn much.
In any case, it was a brilliant successor to the 300 series in this power segment. The 400 found its way, and the 415, the top model, will go down in the annals as a cult model in the Fendt program. Thank you, Paul.
I think we did everything right back then. Okay, thank you, Seb.